Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. On tonight's show, we discuss the most comprehensive ever global report released just yesterday by the UN regarding the state of nature. The picture that this report paints is extremely bleak. According to a body of over 450 experts, the rate of extinction of precious biodiversity is faster than it has ever been in 10 million years. The report highlights that while humans have exceeded in increasing their wealth and the population has more than doubled in the last 50 years, they have lived extremely unsustainable lives, which has caused nature to be in the worst ever condition in all of history. The recklessness of humans has driven 1 million species to the brink of extinction. We also discuss later in the show today the devastation left behind by Cyclone Fani and the relief efforts that are underway. But we start first with the UN report that highlights the nature crisis. Let's take a look at a brief report first.
The relentless human pursuit of economic growth, twinned with climate change, has brought 1 million species at verge of extinction. Our latest global assessment report found that 1 million out of world's 8 million plant, insect and animal species are under threat. Robert Watson, an environmentalist, says the huge loss is a tragedy in itself, but it threatens the survival of human civilization as well.
As we lose biodiversity, it threatens human well-being, all the way, as I've said, from food security, water security, energy security. Also, loss of natural resources in some parts of the world can lead to conflict between people, basically. And especially poor people are hurt, and therefore they're most dependent on natural resources.
Robert Watson said that change can only be brought when people are ready to undo the status quo.
We're losing biodiversity. We're losing species at a historical rate. Potentially 500,000 to 1 million species are threatened with loss. We've lost much of our native forests, much of our native wetlands, and effectively biodiversity needs to be considered as an equally important issue as climate change. It's not just an environmental issue. It is an economic issue, a development issue, a security issue, a social, moral and ethical issue. The time for action clearly is now.
Humans are heavily dependent for food and other resources on natural and artificial ecosystems. Protection of the species which contribute to the ecosystems is needed for human survival.
We're joined by Kanchan Dixit, who is the Deputy Director of ISET, which is a non-profit organization that studies and analyzes the changing social environmental context. He is joining us from Nepal. We're also joined by Professor Srinivas, who is a professor of global environmental policy at the Kanchan Gakuen University, joining us from Japan. Let's begin with Professor Hari. Professor Hari, give us a sense of how alarming this report is.
Yes, obviously there is a lot of issues there to unpack from that report, but the essential point is the focus is not there on nature, but the focus is on humans. The fact of how our lifestyles, our production systems has had a huge impact on the environment. And overloading the environment far beyond its capacity to regenerate or to recover, because humans have been, for example, emitting CO2 for generations, but it's only now that we have gone beyond the capacity of nature to regenerate itself. And I think that's the main message there. It's nature losing out, but losing out due to our lifestyles and human systems.
Yeah. Mr. Kanchan, Professor Hari gave a very strong sense of how humans are contributing towards this issue. But could you also expand upon that? Tell us more about what humans are doing to live extremely unsustainable lives.
You know, if you look at the water systems, land systems, and even all kind of ecosystems, Humans have heavily polluted. They have taken all the resources. They have killed animals. They have harmed on the living beings. And if you look at the trees, almost in all the forests in Nepal and elsewhere have been, destroyed for civilizations and for the land, for the agricultural land and the human settlement. And while talking to this report, I'm drawn by this use of the word transformative change. So that is where we have to, achieve. The new generation today are more towards protecting these species and environment in terms of ecosystems and land and aquatic ecosystems than before. They are more concerned. So in sense, if we can get them to this, the idea of getting them in the transformative change pathway, then I think we can achieve what the report plans to achieve these objectives in future.
Right. And Mr. Kanchan, just focus on one specific aspect of the report, which highlights population growth and the consumption of food and the production of agriculture. The report states that the amount of agricultural production has increased 300% from 1970s. And the fact that we are consuming so much food, that is leading to a lot of environmental degradation. Could you tell us more about that? How are our food patterns contributing towards this issue?
So let me talk in context of Nepal. We have done studies in the local places like in Tarai and Medials and even the mountain areas of Nepal. What the farmers told us that the climate change and the human activities have caused loss of agricultural production, and the local indigenous knowledge have declined, and people are moving towards cities rather than staying and using their local knowledge. And the major part is the rivers, they are low in water, and there is not in context, I'm talking in context of Nepal, the irrigation is far not reachable by the poor farmers, and and there are forest resources. Most of the forests in Nepal have been protected by the communities, and the poor farmers, they don't have access to these resources. Though the climate change and other factors have directly impacted agricultures in Nepal, and we are trying to understand how this interlinked complex system is working.
Yeah. And we're going to explore that a little more in the show. But before that, I'd like to introduce another guest who has joined us, Mr. Harjeet Singh, who is the global lead on climate change at Action Aid International, joining us from Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, the report found a downward trend in nature's ability to provide clean air, water, and good soil. What is leading to nature's inability in providing these very, very fundamental and basic human needs?
So let us understand that the economic model, or the kind of economic model that we've adopted in the last few decades, is mainly responsible for the crisis that we are facing right now, be it climate change or the destruction of natural resources, as we have seen. And the report clearly puts that on the wall, that we as humans are responsible for this destruction. We have exploited nature to the extent that it's now, to a large extent, the extinction is irreversible, and we have only 3 decades left to turn the tide.
Yeah. And you're saying that the economic system here is largely at play, and that is definitely something that the report emphasizes on, and also states that correcting the financial and economic system is the way to make sure that we have a more sustainable future. Do you think with this report coming out, there will be increasing amount of pressure put on international organizations, on governing bodies, to actually make this change?
Absolutely, but let's also recognize that international system is kind of a bubble. It's an important bubble. It creates knowledge, it informs people about the grave impacts of the decision that we have taken, but international organizations can only go so far. It's the national governments that have to take very strong actions, be it the pollution related to plastic, which has increased tenfold since 1980, or be it the direct destruction of species and the way we are polluting our rivers and land and soil. I think that's where most of the policy decisions now have to be taken at the national level. We must draw from these international institutions and the researchers that are released. They are an important indication, because if I talk about this report, 130 plus countries have agreed, have signed up to this analysis. So it does give this kind of a report the credibility which is required. So that's where UN institutions or these kind of international processes are important. But action has to be taken at the national and at the local level. I think this recognition has to be very clear that governments are responsible to act much faster and change the economic model deeply now.
Yeah, and that point is noted here. Professor Hari, want to take the conversation back to the point of agricultural production. And we talked about how it has significantly increased and the pressures it has put on nature and the environment. But with that, of course, the question and the point always arises is that almost 800 million people in the world are still food insecure. How do you think inequality is affecting the environment and impacting the earth?
Obviously, the inequality is the key word here, in the sense that there are people who do not have access to agricultural resources, but there are also people who are overusing agricultural resources. For example, more than 90% of worldwide shrimp production is actually consumed right here in Japan, one country consuming that much volume of shrimp. And you can imagine the impact that shrimp farming has, because most of it comes from Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the marine pollution out of this shrimp farming is incredible. So the inequality, it's not that there is no capacity to produce the food that is necessary for the population growth that we will see, but it is just this inequality, this distribution of agricultural resources across nations. We have to not only look at underconsumption, but we also have to look at overconsumption, where economic, like what Mr. Singh was saying just now, the economic systems that support this level of inequality, I think is incredible. So, in fact, the focus has to be, like I said right at the beginning, on lifestyles. How can we, how do we realize that every decision we take, lifestyle decision we make, has an environmental impact? You go to McDonald's, you have a hamburger, 5,000 liters of water is consumed by a single hamburger, and which means looking after the wheat and the feed for the cow and the the actual preparation of the hamburger itself.
But Professor Hari, let me just interrupt here and add on that specific point. You're saying that lifestyles need to be changed, and of course that is a point that the report has also stressed on, and all our guests agree on. But how does that happen? Does it happen on an individual level? Mr. Singh was talking about how it needs to urgently happen at a national level. But before that happens, what policies need to be taken to create awareness amongst individuals?
True. Now, I think the key point here is to understand what kind of impact we are having from an individual level on the environment. I always start my environmental lectures with this hamburger story, and it really shocks my student, because it is these kind of everyday decisions that we are talking about: hamburgers, clothes that we wear, the energy we use to light up our homes, etc. It is these lifestyle decisions. We need to add an additional layer of decision making that covers environmental impact into these decisions. It is when you say lifestyles, that is to individuals. Even for private sector businesses, for example, they need to look at life cycle thinking, where it is not just the final impact, environmental impact of the final product we're talking about. We're talking of the entire life cycle, from designing.
Definitely. And that's an important point, and hold on to that. Professor, we're also joined by Dr. Samantha Gunasekara, who is the former Director General of Sri Lanka Custom Biodiversity Unit, joining us from Colombo. Thank you so much, Dr. Samantha, for joining us. Dr. Samantha, this report that we're talking about, the UN report that was just released yesterday, painted a very, very bleak picture, stating that almost 1 million species are at the brink of extinction. Tell us about the condition of biodiversity at this point in time.
Actually, Sri Lanka is very, very rich in biodiversity. Sri Lanka is one of the most richest biodiversity rich countries among islands in the world. So, majority of our fauna are endemic to Sri Lanka. Generally, out of flora, generally 1/3 of the entire flora are endemic to Sri Lanka. For an example, we have about 3,157 plants. Out of the 1/3 of them are endemic to Sri Lanka. Majority of them are threatened due to various reasons. As you know, as according to the recent IPBES report, there are many reasons for this extinction. Climate change, overcollection, pollution, invasive, rather than the habitat destruction is the most important factor out of all these. So similar to that, in Sri Lanka, situation also same.
Mr. Harjeet Singh, I'll take this question to you. I was talking about how biodiversity, it being impacted, will resultantly change human survival. Can you tell us more about that? How does biodiversity link with the human survival?
Sure. So first, let me also highlight that one of the 5 factors that have been made responsible for this kind of destruction that we have seen, and one of that is invasive alien species and how we have exploited our land and sea resources. I think that are 2 major reasons that are responsible for this kind of a crisis. And let's also recognize that biodiversity is very important. When we talk about pollination, even now with the kind of industrial production, 75% of pollination for fruits and vegetables still happen through bees. And the kind of chemicals we've used as pesticides and that have actually destroyed bees and several other birds. The kind of radiation we have put into atmosphere that are killing birds or even diverting birds' movements. So all that is very much, part of the ecosystem that we live in. So birds and bees or insects play a very important role in the kind of flora fauna that we see all around.
Yeah.
And that all is getting destroyed. So if we are going to destroy our biodiversity, we are not going to be able to have the kind of resources. Most of our, medicines still come from plants. Even for cancer, as it said that 75% of cancer drugs still rely on natural products or the replica of it. So our food, our water, our medicines, even our culture depends on biodiversity. So if we are going to harm our biodiversity because of as I said earlier, the economic model and the overexploitation that is linked to the economic model, I think that is going to affect our own survival. So as they say, if bees are not going to be there, we are not going to have food in the next few decades or a century. So it's very fundamentally linked. So our own existence is fundamentally linked with biodiversity. Clearly.
Yeah. And Mr. Singh, as you explain this to us, how it's so interlinked with human survival, I want to ask Professor Srinivas regarding this. And when we talk about the fact that we are harming the environment, of course, the argument that always comes up is regarding pollution and linked to that specifically marine life. Can you tell us what policies need to be urgently implemented to curb this? Because we're talking about so much fish being impacted just by plastic bags being in the sea. What needs to be done at a global level to curb this?
At the global level, of course, you see, when you talk of the UN, we are essentially talking of national governments. The UN is not a separate super body, but it's simply a collection of national governments. So most of what we hear at the global level is actually done by and for national government. So most of the action as was raised earlier, will come at the national and local level. But at the global level, we are highlighting the problem of marine pollution. And when you say marine pollution, it's not something that's happening in the middle of the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, but it's happening right in our backyards, because it is our backyards that is really disposing the plastic that flows down rivers and canals into the ocean and affecting the fish and marine life. I think that's what we need to, that's where the link we need to make. Marine pollution is not something that's happening somewhere far away, but it's happening in our backyards, right where we live. And that's the kind of linkages that the report emphasizes, that it's not something that's happening somewhere far away in the sky or in some desert in Africa, but it's happening right in our backyards, and we need to change our lifestyles. It's not that we need to go back to lifestyles that were there about 100 years ago or tried, but we are talking about lifestyles. I come back to the issue of lifestyles. It's a conscious lifestyle that we're talking of, where we look at how we are consuming and how we can reduce our consumption levels, both qualitatively and quantitatively.
Yeah. And we're joined back by Mr. Kanchan. Mr. Kanchan, when we're talking about a sustainable future in this regard, in terms of biodiversity and the environment, how important is it to remember that the Earth's resources are shared resources and shouldn't just be seen as belonging to one nation or one state? Because climate change, all these things are a global phenomenon, not just restricted to one locality.
Exactly. I do support the idea that, since when I talk about Nepal, we are small emitters of the pollution, and we are small emitters of contribution to the climate change. But, if you look at the local livelihood in Nepal, in all mid-hills, Tarai and Himalayas, they are highly affected by climate change and other kind of effect done by the human interventions. Currently we have this our Prime Minister has this vision of the prosperity Nepal, where the country is moving toward prosperity in terms of infrastructure. And we fear that since this is a shared resources among all the living creatures, including plant and animal, it's not human beings. So we need to understand where we are heading now. Is it the infrastructure, or we should find something in between where all the animal, plants, environment, ecosystem and us equally benefit?
Yeah. And we're trying to make sense of everything that is happening, and this report specifically, Mr. Harjeet, when the report, while it painted a very, very bleak picture, it also offered a note of optimism, saying that if we are in trouble, but if we take control of the situation, there is still a possibility for a future. What do you think needs to be done, on a last note, to make sure that we take control of the situation?
Yeah, so we need to have hope at the end of it, even if it's a massive crisis that we are facing. So the hope keeps us alive, and we need to keep looking forward. So the report does talk about the actions that we need to take vis-a-vis different sectors, such as agriculture, fisheries, or we need to look at how we are urbanizing our countries and what kind of consumption patterns we have. I think several things have already been said. So in terms of agriculture, we need to protect local species, local genes. We need to really look at the kind of supply chains we have, how we can avoid food wastage, use of agrochemicals. So there are a number of things that have been highlighted. Of course, when the full report comes out later this year, it will have a lot more solutions. Similarly, on fisheries, we are talking about sustainable fishing, which used to be part of our culture. And I think we really need to go back a couple of decades ago when we were quite sustainable in our approaches, and the kind of industrial model, and I cannot stop saying that, the industrial model is largely responsible, be it agriculture, be it fisheries, be it the kind of construction industry we have created, which is so environmentally hazardous. So those options have been put on the table, and I think we need to take them into account, put them into national policies, and as Professor Hari said, we need to also look at how individual behaviors can be changed.
Yeah, right. And with that individual behavior, Professor Hari, you told us what individuals need to do at a small level, but also just slightly touching on this point before we end the segment, what do developing nations need to do when there is so much pressure being put on every state to curb pollution, but also that in developing nations want to move on the same road of progress that developed nations wanted to? What do they need to keep in mind?
Yes, I think essentially what we're talking of is a kind of developmental approach that leapfrogs some of the problems that we have normally associated with development, where economic growth and environmental management has been separated out so far. I think what we are looking at is a development model, whether it is at the individual and the city level, at the state level or national level, to look at how we can merge these two pathways of both having economic growth but also managing the environmental impacts. One of the things that's that's gaining popularity among national governments is the concept of green economy, for example, or a circular economy, where we use nature as a model for economic growth.
And Professor Hari, that's a great point to end the segment on, because we are talking about how we need to move in a more friendly manner and make sure that environmental degradation is not the price we're paying for economic growth. With that, I'd like to thank Mr. Harjeet Singh for joining us, Mr. Kanchan for joining us, Professor Hari for joining us, Dr. Samantha for joining us. We're going to take a short break. Stay with us. We're going to be back with another story. Welcome back to Indus Special while we move on to our next story. Now, Cyclone Fani, a rare summer cyclone, swept across India and Bangladesh last weekend, leaving dozens dead and hundreds of homes destroyed. Despite its extremely severe nature, Indian and Bangladeshi authorities were able to evacuate about 1 million people, respectively. Let's take a deeper look at the story and what is now being done as a part of the relief efforts. Joining us for this discussion today is Mr. Omair Ahmed, who is a South Asian editor of the Third Pole, joining us from Delhi. We're also joined by Mr. Hridayesh Joshi, who is a journalist joining us from Banaras, India. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Hridayesh, let me begin with you. What is the on-ground situation right now? How many people have been evacuated? And just give us a better sense of the picture.
See, the thing is that it's not been the first time India is facing such disaster. For last 1 decade, we have seen a lot of quote unquote these natural calamities. So this time and before in last 3-4 years, the preparedness has increased. And now, the better disaster management mechanism is in place. So in Odisha, everybody knows that more than 1 million people were evacuated. Within 24 hours. For that, we will have to thank the better early warning mechanism in place, and that is because all the shelter homes were in place. The administration was ready to evacuate. A rapid transit from the endangered shoreline to the safe shelter houses was in place, and despite that, there was a lot of damage in the temple city of Puri along the coast, and also the capital city of Bhubaneswar of Odisha. So the things have not completely back on track. Still, I was speaking to some of the people. Omair will tell you more because I believe he visited to the ground. But electricity and telephone lines were still not working till last evening in the major parts of the city.
Yeah, Mr. Joshi, you mentioned here that within 24 hours, so many people were evacuated. How many people, how many teams, which governmental bodies, were there NGOs around that were helping people evacuate the scene? What can you tell us about that?
See, a lot of government bodies, NGOs, and also volunteers. I was being told that more than around 50,000 volunteers was also working. But the chief minister himself took a meeting with the officers just before the cyclone had to land. And we are being told that weeks ago, even months before, they knew that cyclone of this intensity and this severity is landing. So I would like to tell you that in 2013 also, a pilot landed in Odisha. Besides the much talked cyclone in 1999, which killed more than 10,000 people, and also Hudhud arrived at a neighboring state of Visakhapatnam, which I covered in 2014. Which devastated Visakhapatnam. Also, it had its own effect on Odisha and other parts of shoreline, east coast of India. So they have been, now they are becoming quite habitual of, attending and dealing with these kind of disasters.
Yeah.
But there is a other side of this we will discuss ahead in the program.
Yeah, right. Mr. Omair, as we heard Mr. Joshi talk about how so many people were evacuated and the warning signs were picked up on, can you tell us about the nature of this cyclone? It's being regarded as being very rare and hard to predict. Is that the case here? And if it is so, how were the government authorities working towards predicting where it's going to land and how they're going to evacuate the scene?
It's not that tropical cyclones are rare. They're a fairly common phenomena. What's rare is them hitting land at such speed, and it's a little difficult to exactly track which direction they will go. Now, there's a couple of things that we have to bear in mind. What is a tropical cyclone is basically a circulation of a storm, right? And what it does is it takes heat out from near the tropics and dispatches it into cooler areas. And this is a natural cycle for the planet, just how it keeps its temperatures in circulation. Cyclone is it's basically a tropical storms section is called a cyclone when its speeds go over 120 kilometers an hour. In the case of Cyclone Fani, the speeds were over 200 kilometers an hour. So it was a particularly strong tropical cyclone.
Yeah.
We've gotten better at this partially because there are now far, far more cyclones and hurricanes hitting the land. And that is because of global warming. We've got hotter sea temperatures, right? And if you've got hotter sea temperatures, you need to get rid of that heat for the globe to balance, which is one of the reasons why you're getting more frequent cyclones and with greater intensity.
And in the future, is it expected that more of these cyclones, more of these tropical cyclones with global warming, as you're mentioning, will increase in frequency? Is that the general trend?
That is basically what science is telling us. They will become bigger, more frequent, more powerful.
Yeah. And following what India has done here in evacuating and getting used to the fact that more cyclones are touching ground, what do other countries need to make sure they need to do in well advanced situations in order to make sure that they're able to take preemptive measures for these natural disasters?
Okay. So we knew that there was, cyclone season was about to come in a few weeks ago. International NGOs had started giving, tarpaulins and stuff like that, but tarpaulins will not help in such high winds. And therefore, state governments have to act preemptively to create good storm shelters that can withstand such speeds. There needs to be a plan of evacuation, as apparently Orissa was able to do very well. You need to make sure that there are no fishermen out at sea at such times, because it's going to be very hard to rescue them. All of these requires a very good communication mechanism and a very good coordination at local and state level authorities. I think Hridayesh was talking about this, and we'll get into this. But although we've saved lives, this will have a devastating effect on livelihoods. Right, so a lot of people will have lost their houses, will have their shops would have been broken up. Most of these people do not necessarily have insurance, and anyway, insurance doesn't necessarily cover all the costs.
Yeah.
So although we've saved lives, a lot of people are going to find it very difficult to get back on their feet. And that's going to be the big challenge.
Yeah, and Mr. Omair, hold on to that thought while with this question to Mr. Hridayesh and ask him how much infrastructure was damaged, how many shops were damaged with the cyclone.
The damage of infrastructure and everything this is the one thing. As I told you that still the telephone lines and the electricity was not restored, and we know that once the electricity lines are damaged, then mobile towers don't work until the line is restored. But as we know that effective infrastructure of disaster management system and better early warning mechanism can minimize the loss of human lives and property. But it is a matter of now common knowledge that calamities like these cyclones, floods, droughts are hitting again and again with more frequency and more severity. This is an established fact. We will have to look at this. Last year, in October, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change (IPCC) Special Report clearly told us that these things will increase until, as Omair was telling us, if sea water temperature will increase. These things will improve, it will increase, and India, Pakistan and Bangladesh together should understand they are going to be the biggest victim of it, because the recent report by American General has proved that the richer nations are becoming richer due to climate change, but the poorer nations like India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, they are facing the brunt and they are becoming poorer by the consequences by such disasters. So we will have to look at that.
Mr. Joshi, you're saying that the brunt of this is going to be faced by these developing nations, and we're already seeing this, the effects of climate change. What do you think? Is there a sense of urgency developing within these countries to take a hold of the situation?
There is a sense of urgency. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all these countries, rather than talking about making missiles or tanks or nuclear bombs, we should start fighting poverty, which is going to increase because of these things. We should start working together in a direction where we can build up pressure on rich countries like European Union, China, America, who are emitting carbon like anything. So as long as they don't switch to cleaner energy. We all know Donald Trump, what he is doing. He's a climate denier. He's a promoter of fossil fuel. So what he is going to do, our posterity, our future generation are going to face that trend, because as the global warming increases, we are going to face such disasters more and more. These are not natural calamities. I'll just give you a brief example. In 2017, we faced Oki in our west coast. And it is a known truth that in West Coast, people live much closer to than in comparison of the East Coast of India. And that cyclone came deep in the sea. Still, it killed 500 people. Had it come on the coast, what would have happened? We all know this.
And Mr. Hridayesh, that's a very strong point to make, and I would like Mr. Omair to also comment on it. He mentioned how there needs to be more pressure on the developed nations, especially like the United States, in which the president is a climate change denier. What do you have to say to that? What do you think about international collaboration in order to make sure that these natural disasters, if they're not prevented, but there's some sort of thing to preempt them?
You can't preempt them, not exactly. And I mean, these are natural disasters that are being supercharged because of human action, right? Now, for the last 10, 20 years within the UN system, we've had this debate about who pays for the loss and damage generated by this supercharging of natural disasters. And so far, developed countries have basically blocked this debate. I do not know whether this will move forward. I don't know how successful we will be. As Hridayesh says, unfortunately, what's happened is that we're basically, the developing countries that are facing the brunt of this are so divided among ourselves that we cannot even present a joint call of action to developed countries. I think one thing we have to look as a positive, India's response in this current cyclone has been excellent. Evacuating 1 million people is no joke. We saw in the US how devastating Hurricane Katrina was and how badly the US managed it despite having far, far more money and having far, far more institutions. A hurricane and a cyclone are two names for pretty much the same thing. So we did better. Why did we do better? And it's not because we had more money. It's because of better organization. And I think one of the ways that developing countries will have to learn how to deal with this is by showing that they themselves are very good at handling these situations.
But you mentioned here, Omair, just on that point, you mentioned that India had better organization. Could you just expand on that point? What other countries can learn from how India managed this disaster?
Well, I think there's 2 or 3 things from Orissa that we have to take that they did well. One was that they paid attention to the science. Right? We cannot, the Indian Meteorological Department gave them good data and they took it seriously. This cannot be overemphasized. As Hridayesh was talking about, we cannot have leaders like Trump who just are denying basic science. Because if you do that, you're setting yourself up for disaster. I mean, the last leader who did that was George W. Bush, and he was a president in charge when Hurricane Katrina hit. There was a lot of data to say how things were going to be bad in Hurricane Katrina,
right?
But they didn't pay attention. The second part of it is that one of the reasons why W's government was so ineffective was because society in the areas where Hurricane Katrina hit was very divided. In the case of Orissa, the state came together, the communities listened to each other, there was a certain trust in the government. Now, this is incredibly important because if you do not believe that the government is working in your behalf, you won't obey them because you won't feel that it's in your self-interest. And so that making sure that science is credible, listening to it, decision makers doing that.
Mr. Omair, and those are very strong points that you've highlighted here, why the disaster management was successful in this case. Mr. Joshi, just talking about the relief efforts and what is happening on that front. How many shelters are there and what is the need of the people at this moment? Food, shelter, water, what exactly do they need the most?
Actually, all of them they need. And good thing is that the help is pouring in from all the directions. Every state in India, they are contributing. And the thing is that, more than 10 billion rupees have been pumped in the disaster, in the relief work. So, but my point is, I'll take it a little further. Knowledge sharing. And also, as Omair told, that India's weather department, they gave it better information to the administration. Administration took it seriously. But there should be coordination among states. There should be coordination among the rescue forces, and there should be coordination among the countries in the subcontinent. So that if a cyclone, rises from Arabian Sea and can affect the Pakistan, India can inform Pakistan about that. Or if a cyclone, rising from Bay of Bengal and Bangladesh and India can do the information sharing, that will be important. So that rescue work is one thing, but preventing the damage of life, property, and life, that will be crucial in future.
All right, Mr. Joshi, and that's something that Mr. Omair also highlighted, that in the subcontinent, in the region, there needs to be collaboration before you take this matter forward on the international front, and that is something that everyone is hoping for. With that, I'd like to thank Mr. Omair Ahmed for joining us, Mr. Hridayesh Joshi for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.